Hello and welcome to this session and to the Bad Crime Writers Festival more broadly. Welcome also to those joining us on Zoom, including viewers throughout New South Wales who are watching from your local library or from home, courtesy of your local library. Today we are on Gadigal land, and as we gather to share stories and knowledge, let us reflect on the rich history of storytelling in this place. I pay my respects to elders past and present and to any First Nations people in the audience today. Before we start, please ensure that your phones are switched off or turned on to silent at least, and so that there's no interruptions. And please don't record this session. If you're taking photos, please turn off your flash. And also feel free to share this widely on whatever your platform of choice is, at Bad Crime Sydney or hashtag Bad Crimes Sydney 22. And if there's an emergency, just go back the way you came in. Look for the exit sign, try and get out. I'm Michael Brissenden, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to the Dixon Room. We'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions from the audience and from possibly from people on Zoom. If you're joining in Zoom, please send your questions through using the chat function about 20 minutes before the end of the session, and we'll do our best to include them. Right. Well, look, once again, welcome to this session. This is the hottest little corner of crime fiction in Australia at the moment, rural noir, or dingo noir, as it's sometimes referred to. And we have a very interesting cross-section of the genre here today that goes from New England in the 1970s with Greg Woodward. We have Adrian Hyland at the end, and his book Canticle Creek, which is a sort of contemporary rural noir set in Victoria. And of course, Margaret Hickey with Stone Town, and hers is a rural crime book, also a contemporary one set in regional South Australia, rural South Australia. So quite a broad cross-section of what is and has been for the last couple of years the hottest little corner of crime fiction. What I'd like to do to start with is just ask each one of you to just give us a quick elevator pitch about your books, so that people in the audience can get an idea of what they are and what you've written, and then we'll move on to some broader questions. Greg.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My book, The Carnival is Over, is a sequel to the earlier book, The Night Whistler, and you don't have to have read that to enjoy The Carnival is Over. But if you have, it's 5 years on, and the same gang are all there, the ones that lived through the first book. It's 1971. It's a cold, wet spring in the small town of Moorabool, New England. And at 17 years old, Hal and his on-again, off-again Aboriginal girlfriend, Ali, are both working in jobs they hate at the local abattoir and barely talking to each other. And Hal, for his sins, is working on a good behaviour bond and paying off a stolen car that he and his mate Lloyd smashed. And the only thing that keeps him sane, he's working in the offal room at the moment at the abattoir and hating it. And the only thing that keeps him together is his friendship with beautiful, worldly wise Christine, the young forewoman who kind of sticks up for him against the bullies. On the other side of town, Sergeant Mick Goodenough is now the head of the 4-person police station at Moorabool, and he's been in a long-running affair with his old flame Eileen, who is married to his one-time mentor, the mayor of Moorabool. And it is the 70s after all. And so when a series of unlikely suicides happen in the town, Mick's suspicions are aroused, and he begins a kind of covert investigation that puts him at loggerheads with the powers that be in the town, and also widens the cracks in his relationship with Eileen.
Don't give too much away, Greg.
I won't give too much away. No, it's an elevator pitch after all, isn't it?
It's a very long elevator ride.
Sorry about that. Suffice to say, the choices that Mick makes wind up having some fairly tragic and brutal consequences.
So Stonetown is about a detective, Mark Ariti, who is in my first novel, Cutter's End, returns home to his hometown of Burralama, and he's so sad because his mother has died, and he's so sad. And he's moved back to her house. And at the same time, a body is found in the bush, and it's a local real estate agent. Nobody's particularly sad, but that's the crime. And at the same time, as well as this crime's going on, there's a crime of national significance, which is that a policewoman has gone missing. And that's the crime that is engulfing the nation at the moment. This seemingly minor crime is going on in the bush.
Adrian?
Oh, thanks. My book is not so much rural noir as rural lumineux. It's set in the middle of a blazing hot summer, and the sort of theme flowing under the book is basically that heat and fire and so on. And you know, I live in a very bushfire prone part of Victoria, and it's sort of, particularly Black Saturday, sort of overwhelmed a lot of my imagination and some of the things I've done as a firefighter since then. But this is basically the story of a young policewoman who the book's called Canticle Creek, did I say that? And she is a young police officer, the main character, Jessie Redpath, who comes down and gets involved in, well, there's a crime committed, a young couple are murdered, and she just gets involved in various local issues, such as be they logging or drug dealing or drug labs and so on, or there's just those sort of things. That'll do.
Okay.
And I've worked in an offal room too, Greg. So,
well,
so
I'm going to get to offal in a minute. We're not done.
I'll be checking up on the details.
So as I said, this has become the hottest sort of selling area of crime fiction in the last couple of years, largely off the back of Jane Harper most recently, and people like Jane Harper and Chris Hammer. But I mean, the weird thing is that actually this sort of crime fiction has been around in Australia for a really long time. I mean, Wake in Fright, you know, goes way back.
The Upfield.
Yep. I mean, people have been writing it for ages and ages and ages, but it's really only just started to capture the public imagination, both here and abroad. And I wonder what your reflections on that are and why you think that is so. Margaret, I mean, Margaret, for instance, just last night won the Danger Award for her latest book.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I think there's a number of reasons, and there's some really practical reasons about it. For setting a crime in a small rural town or in a rural setting, there is so many places you can hide a body. It's easier to hide a body in a regional setting than it is as a writer. I go for walk. I live in the bush, and I go for walks every morning. And every morning I count at least 1,000 good spots I could put a potential victim. My husband doesn't walk with me most mornings. But I think that's one reason. So there's the practical reasons. You can also put your characters under really extreme conditions. So drought, fire, flood, dust storms, mouse plagues, terrible flies, locusts, you know, the grasshoppers. Where I am at the moment, we have the hairy panic. I don't know whether we've heard about that. That's the weed that engulfs everywhere and really takes over houses. So I think that, and then of course there's also our deep at the heart of our psyche, or as mine, you know, as white Australians, that no one can hear you scream when you're out in the bush. And do we really belong here? There's a sense of uncanny, which I think makes crime writing in rural places really compelling.
Yeah, I think at one point you said, if I've got this right, I'll find it in a minute. There was a great quote you had in your book about that. Anyway, I'll come back to that. About basically this being the most, for white Australia, this is the most sort of feared place in the country and the most unsettling place to live. And it's strange why people would want to live in a place that they're so afraid of, but that is the case in a lot of small towns. Greg, do you have a view?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that small towns are a very claustrophobic place to be in. especially a very small town where you may not know everyone in the town, but you'll know who they are you'll know the look of them. And if they've done something or they stick out in any way, you will certainly know them, or you'll be known. And yeah, I think that you said you wondered why they're working, our small town noir, if you like, is working so well in an international way. Well, it is the setting, isn't it? I mean, it's Scandi noir works beautifully as well, but I think that people are getting used to the fact that Australia is not just about desert, it's not just about way out back, it's about all sorts of towns in all sorts of climates as well.
Yeah, we're sort of the flip side of Scandi noir, aren't we? Like it's the frozen wasteland or the dry, hot, burnt wasteland. And Adrian, yours, is very much focused on the threat of fire and the threat of climate and the threat of, this thing about these threats that you were talking about have become sort of amplified in the public's imagination as well over the last couple of years. And I think, particularly weather-related threats have become so front of mind for people, haven't they?
Yeah. I would just when Greg mentioned what he was just saying, then I was thinking maybe, how can I put this? With maybe the first inspiration, the real sort of flash of light that gave me at least the themes of this book were a few years ago when I'm a volunteer firefighter, and for the first time ever, I thought we were basically being burnt over, and I was sort of on the back of the truck just trying to fight it. Oh, sorry, I was on the back of the truck trying to control it a bit, and this wave of heat and just blasted out of this gorge that we were sort of on the edge of trying to keep it down. I got sort of thrown onto the back, sort of over on the back bit of the truck, hitting on the metal floor. And just as I hit the deck, all my eyes were flashing. I just sort of had this feeling that this is just the future that awaits us all if we didn't do something about climate change, basically.
So perhaps one of the good things about us for Australian crime is we've got a future in the climate crisis.
Yeah, well,
maybe Nordic noir doesn't.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yes.
So this idea of menace being the central character of crime fiction, it's not just the weather, it's not just the place, it's not just, but they do all coalesce, as we've been discussing, quite neatly in a small town where everybody knows each other. Everybody's known each other probably too long. They're a bit too familiar. Everybody knows, they think they know each other, but perhaps they don't really know quite as much as they should. And they think they know people's secrets, but clearly they don't. Anyone? I mean, you're all writing in this sort of space about small communities.
I was just thinking, when I sort of looked at the theme today, I was thinking about small towns and why they're, and I was thinking of this story when I left uni, I went to, as you sort of do the sort of things you do when you've got an arts degree, I went and worked in a mining town for a while. And I remember in the first couple of days, my girlfriend and I, we were in this house in this very rough sort of area. We stepped out with our her little terrier, stepped out the front door, out the front of the driveway, and this massive, like an overgrown pit bull came leaping over the fence, grabbed her little dog by the throat and had it on the ground. And then about 10 seconds, the dog was, and my wife got badly bitten trying to prise its jaws apart. And I was trying to kick it. And then I put my back out. Then the owner came rushing out first with a big rock, and then with a great lump of concrete. And so it was smashing the dog on the head, trying to get it to release our little terrier. And then finally the owner had grabbed, it looked like a pit bull himself actually, but he grabbed the hose and turned on full blast and rammed it down the dog's throat. And and as we were rushing the dog off to the vet, a minute later, I just reflected, then I'd sort of come from living in uni share houses and so on around Carlton. And that's one thing that struck me, the sort of people you meet in those little towns are the sort of people you wouldn't meet when you're living in, I don't know, Rose Bay, whatever your equivalents are up here.
They wouldn't do that to a cavoodle.
Sorry?
They wouldn't do that to a cavoodle.
About that though, because in small towns, and so I'm 50 this year, and I've lived in small towns pretty much all my life. In small towns, like my primary school, there's 10 kids at all the schools I went to. And I think small towns sometimes get a bit of short shrift in books and in novels. And yes, there are characters like that, but you can't tell me that you go down to Melbourne and there's people with big pit bulls that go and, and I think
they weren't hanging around the Melbourne Uni scene in Carlton when I was anyway.
Well, that's Melbourne Uni.
Yeah.
But I think, but country towns, they're a microcosm of society. You will get really wealthy landowners living in small country towns alongside people like your mate, kicking the dog, and people who are down and out. I think it's a little microcosm of any sort of society. And there's a lot of really intelligent, interested, engaged, wonderful people.
But also, isn't it the case that those different sorts of people and different levels of society mix much
close
more
up, yeah.
fluidly and easily in a small town, so they know each other, whereas perhaps in Toorak, like they wouldn't, like it wouldn't be the same.
They do mix in those small towns, but when I was living in the 70s, they didn't always mix. For instance, there were no Aboriginal people that turned up at the Gentlemen's Club. In fact, there weren't very many working class people or abattoir workers that turned up at the Gentlemen's Club. The Gentlemen's Club, you had to earn your place, I believe, by being a gentleman, and not too many women in the Gentlemen's Club either. So it was quite hierarchical. The Armadale of my youth, I went to UNE there and spent about 5 years on and off because I dropped out a couple of times of uni. And it was a place where I had wonderful times, some of the best times of my life, and made some of the best friends, and also had some of the worst times and made some of the worst enemies of my life as well. So, well, yes.
It's an interesting point you make. And let's talk about Indigenous characters in these books, because both Adrian and Greg have Indigenous characters central to the story. And although your character is dead for most of the book, not all the book, this is, I guess, the place of Indigenous characters in rural crime fiction is really interesting. How people are starting to have to look at that and address that, and often it seems that this is a way to allow the narrative to talk about the injustices. Is that the way you see it? And is that, I mean, it's almost hard to imagine writing a book now without, set in a rural community, without putting some sort of Indigenous flavour in it, isn't it?
Agree. I mean, in my case, they were there. Indigenous people were there. In the 70s, in 70s Armadale, I didn't question the fact that you didn't see them very often. You're more likely in Armadale to meet a Black African person, and I did. I met a few through the uni, Asian people, people from Hong Kong and India and so on. You're more likely to meet them than you would an Aboriginal person, a young Aboriginal guy my own age. It took a long time before I met Aboriginal guys my age and so on there. But that was because there was an apartheid in town. It was an unwritten apartheid. In fact, the finger was pointed quite a lot at South African apartheid without anybody questioning that there might be such a rift in our own town, which was, we thought it was fair go to everyone. You and your friends would make jokes about wogs and chocos and dagos and bungs, etc., and all the other, and Irish people as well, of course. But there was never any sense that was anything other than a very fair place to live and so on. But eventually I did realise that the reason you didn't see the Aboriginal people in town was most of them tended to live out at a place called the Tip, because it was in fact an old tip, and there was a kind of shanty town out there. Some people did live in the town, but yeah, there was that gap always.
Adrian, well, no, you.
I was just going to say, when I eventually left the offal room and when I worked in mines for a while, but I spent 10 or 11 years working with very traditional Indigenous people in the Tanami and those sort of places, and the things that I learned from them in that period really underlies everything the way I think about the bush now. Just everything. when I wrote a book about the Black Saturday bushfires a few years ago, I just realised that my understanding here of fire was based on the sort of things that I saw there. So it just, to me, that's just crucial, and it's very that appreciation and understanding the way they relate to their environment. If we don't learn something of that, then we're doomed as a society, I think.
I mean, I think there's interesting, isn't it, how crime fiction gives you room for social commentary as well, without being didactic, but it often can reflect, you know, what's really going on through dialogue, through through setting, through place, in a way that you know, people find interesting and enjoyable to read. But actually, you can say something quite significant in your books.
Yeah, often more than literary fiction does.
Yes.
I find, yeah, sort of literary fiction is a bit more obsessed with psychology and humans relating to each other, and so often there are deeper social statements in crime fiction. They're manifested rather than talked about. And
do you think about that when you're writing it, Margaret?
No, I don't consciously put in, no, I don't. I try and write with a free mind, if that makes sense, and just write every day. I write a paragraph or a page, and then the next day I follow on and I follow on. But of course, themes that I care about come through. Of course they do, but I don't consciously put them in there. So class is often in my novels. The rural metro divide is in there, and treatment of women, of course, and young women in particular, all comes through. But I don't consciously put them in there. No, it's only afterwards often that I think, oh, that's come out. Yeah.
A friend of mine who was a copious crime reader used to say, crime fiction's about values. It's about values. So the detective usually had to have a stance on something, and in every good book they tend to. So yes, it is about values, but I don't kind of pick the value I want to write about. I simply want to tell a story. But when I wrote the first story, it came out of an incident that happened to my family, in my family's own history. It was based around the year of my mother's stalker that we never knew anything about until Mum told me when I was a young filmmaker, 30 years after the event. But I just want to tell a story and make it entertaining, but I do want the background to reflect what's going on in the town at the time. And I choose the 60s and 70s to write about, not because it's some kind of time capsule, because it's a kind of microcosm and a reflection of what's going on in small towns and indeed some cities even now, even though, yes, things have changed a lot, we hope, but then some things haven't changed that much.
Yeah, it's a tussle between good and evil, isn't it? Between right and wrong and morality, and all of that comes to play. And
shades of grey, lots of shades of grey. I like very dark characters that surprise you with a kind of strange act of kindness, and seemingly good characters that have a streak of meanness in them as well.
Let's talk about the process a little, and research in particular. Let's go to the awful question to start with. Where did you spend time in a kidney room, or?
Thank God I didn't. I did get offered a job as a student from the Student Employment Service or something, as I think it was on the kill floor of the abattoir, and I wasn't keen. I knocked it back, and instead I went and shoveled cement or scraped bricks instead, which was not much better, but you didn't have to kill anything to do that. But I simply went to the Historical Society and said, do you know any people who used to work in the Guyra abattoirs in the early 70s? And I was told by the lady, oh yeah, come and meet Les. He's one of our members. He's one of the Historical Society people. So I came and met Les, and I got the rundown on what it was like to be a young abattoir worker, because he'd started at the age of 17, about the year my book was set, 71, and he'd gone right through for a career as a abattoir manager all the way to the top as an abattoir manager when the abattoir finally shut in about 85 or 86. He was very interesting and yeah, strangely funny, blackly funny.
You'd have to have some sort of sense of humour to keep doing the job for that long, wouldn't you? Adrian, a lot of yours, clearly the rural firefighting experiences, had quite a big impact on you, and there's quite a lot of imparted knowledge in the book about, how you look at fire and how you judge it and assess it and all that stuff.
I'm not quite sure what the question is. But
well, I mean, just talk about your experience and how you've used it in your writing.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I sort of already have, but I mean, I just base it what my own actual experiences, but I also do. Oh, sorry. I also do just a lot of research. I read. There's a writer, one of the best non-fiction writers in the world, I think, is a fellow called Stephen Pine, an American, who gets you to think about fire in ways that I never have before. You're looking him up. He's Stephen J. Pine. But yes, no, but
could I say that I thought that sequence, those chapters near the end, when the fire happens, without giving plot spoilers away, were absolutely amazing. You were completely there, and
thanks.
And it was totally convincing. And the idea of the fire sucking the oxygen out of your lungs, and people being trapped, and the noise, this train-like noise, and so on.
Yes,
I thought it was amazing.
Adrian, you're selling yourself short. And also King Lake, did King Lake win the Ned Kelly or something?
But it was a non-fiction.
It's gripping read. On
Thanks.
fire, the Black Saturday fires.
Black Saturday, it was a huge, where we live, not so much our house, it was a few yards from our house, but where my daughter goes to school, a little place called Strathewen, it was actually the worst hit community in Victoria. There was only 200 people lived there, and there were 26 deaths there. It was just, and so many, and we went to so many funerals, and it just, and my daughter lost a lot of friends and school and everything. It was just a shocking event. And it's just loomed hugely large in my imagination. And it's just, in our community, it acts as a sort of, it's a bonding thing. And also it sort of gives us hope. One of the, also a whole family we know died, except they had one young girl, a 12-year-old girl who was shockingly injured and so on in the fire. It was very lucky to survive. She was my daughter's best friend and still is one of her best friends. That young 12-year-old then is now a 20-year-old who just in the last year has started working as a pilot with Qantas. And it just, the whole community knew it, and it just gave us all a bit of a lift, seeing that recovery, all of her family dying, her parents dying, and those sort of things loom large in my imagination.
And Margaret, you haven't got any offal in your books, but clearly there's a lot of research.
I haven't got
how do you approach it?
Yes. No, you haven't got offal. Yeah. I like a bit of offal, actually. Yeah. So my books are kind of always landscape based. So I was thinking where I live, I go for walks every day around the Mount Chiltern Pilot National Park, and I was just thinking about that. And sometimes I see men invariably with binoculars, rarely, but watching in the bush. And the first time I thought they were spying on me, I was really frightened, but they're birders, they're twitchers. And that got me thinking about the idea of surveillance and watching in the bush. And when I first moved to this part, we've moved around this area a bit, we moved actually because of bushfires. Our sons were little babies, and we woke up in the night to the most chilling scream you've ever heard in your life. The most horrible scream. And we both woke up. We got torches, and Bernie, my husband, was stumbling through the bush looking for a woman who was being attacked. and I was sort of calling the police, trying to find the phone ring, and then it stopped, and then 10 seconds later it started again, and then we realized that it was a bird probably. And the next day we looked up our bird book, Ninox conivans, and the description is during mating season, the barking owl can sound like a wailing, sobbing scream. And since then I've heard it, they're endangered, the birds. They're best found around where I live, but I've heard it about 3 or 4 times again since, and it never loses its chill. Have you heard it, Adrian?
We've got them at our place. Yeah.
And do you hear that?
Yeah, it's incredible noise. We were the same thing.
Normally they sound like, normally they sound like, whoop, 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 whoop. And that's quite a nice sound. But it's like, but it's
good.
It's like that, isn't it?
Weird.
It's
a terrible
weird
noise.
And it just got me thinking. And then I started reading the white settlers when they first came here, how they would hear this sound and basically just jump in the harbour and want to swim back to wherever they're from, Shropshire or whatever. But we I thought that will be a really good start to a novel.
And it is a fabulous plot line.
Yeah, it certainly is.
But the other interesting thing that comes through all of the books, but particularly your 2 more contemporary books, is the sort of pressures that are on small towns over development, the pressures that small towns are facing through change that's sort of forced on communities that haven't had this sort of pressure ever. And this is really intensifying, isn't it? So that creates another great sort of plot undercurrent for writers in this genre. Yep.
Oh yeah, yes, it does. That's right. Yeah, I mean, you just feel the tension where we live. Thank God, it's called the Green Wedge of Melbourne. So they're very restricted on what you can do in it, but still, we see just our society gradually destroying it. We had a neighbour who was getting just tons and tons and tons of leftover building materials from the city and fill inside, just dumping on his property and just doing terrible damage till we report it. So it's just one of the dominant themes of most of us who live in the bush and who care about it, try and defend it.
Yeah, and I went to a meeting 3 weeks ago in the town about so the town, we needed a new assistant principal and they couldn't hire one because there's no teacher. I'm a teacher as well, and there are no teachers. So it's worse than what it appears in the media, I think. But we couldn't get one. And eventually they got an assistant principal and the town was really excited, but he couldn't afford a place to live, and there was no places for him to live because it's a really beautiful area where I live, and a lot of the places are now holiday rentals, and he was priced out, and so he turned down the job. And so we had this big whole meeting. How do we do this? How do we get people to stay when there is nowhere to live?
And how do you then take that and use it as a plot device?
Well, I suppose I'm certainly not anti-metro or anything. Absolutely not. But I think I feel strongly about these issues because they affect my work and my family and my boys and how they'll grow up and that sort of thing. But I suppose I don't use it, as I said, to push an issue, but possibly it does come through a little bit, that concern what we perhaps need to do. Perhaps more funding needs to go into rural areas, perhaps with things like housing and development.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I don't really consciously use any of those things as plots. I get more obsessed with creating a good sentence than a plot. But
it's just a reality.
Yeah,
it's part of the story. So here's a question that people are often asked, writers are often asked: what does come first, plot or character? Greg, for you?
Character for me.
Plot or character.
Stephen King's book on writing says he likes to start with a bunch of characters and throw them into a situation. He does, but then he's a pantser. I don't know how to be a pantser. I wish I did, but yeah, I tend to plot everything.
But explain what a pantser is, in case people don't know.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
a pantser is basically someone who sits down on the seat of their pants and just makes it up as they go along. And a plotter is someone who plots everything
Yeah.
within an inch of its life and then writes the story around the plot.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot of people who do a bit of both as well.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot of crime writers are pantsers, but people like Jane
Pantsers,
Harper
yeah.
plot, and quite a few of us. I don't know what the ratio is, but I tend to plot. But character for me is what drives it. You know, character is plot, plot is character. So I want a character that want to spend hours and hours and weeks with, and that's compelling and that is on a journey of change. I don't have to love them. I certainly don't have to even like them to begin with, but I want to feel compelled by them to stay the journey.
For me, it would be plot, I think, would be story comes first, and then I sort of map everything in. I'm definitely a pantser. So for both my novels, I sit down and I write, I read the next bit and then I write and then I read and then I write like that. And for Cutter's End, I found out who the killer was at 72,000 words. And then at Stone Town, it was around 70 as well. And now I'm writing the third one and I'm sort of thinking of a few who it could be, but I'm at about 50,000 words and I'm not sure. But so maybe it'll happen again. I don't know.
Well, it seems to be working. Adrian?
Plotter. If you sort of think of plotter as pantser as a kind of spectrum, go to the pantser end, take a packed lunch and saddle up your horse and keep going out to the west, and eventually end up sort of where I am.
An extreme pantsing.
Extreme pantser. I know my second novel began with an image with just a rock with a rock formation in the desert, and I never know what, but it's become quite critical. And maybe this one that I just did sort of began with that first fire that I described. That was really that.
So one idea, and then you just took it from there.
Not even an idea so much
image.
as an image, yeah, something of that there, or truth, or something that hits me.
Yeah, wow, that's fantastic. I mean, it's amazing how different people's approach to this is. You know, some people, as I say, are a mixture of two. Others, like you, are quite meticulous about how you plot it. Do you allow for change? I mean, what happens if you?
Yeah, I do. Of course I do.
Yeah.
When I come from a screenwriting background, and basically, I think a lot of us who write screenplays are used to plotting things on cards and on whiteboards and so on. And I did that while constructing my first book, the outline of it. But at the end, in the last 20% or something, I wasn't happy with the ending. And so I did start pantsing it from that. And I was astonished that lovely surprises started happening and accidents. And I had no idea either how it was going to end, but I did find out, having plotted the hell out of it and done many drafts of the screenplay that it came from, I did find that I was able to do some pantsing. So I'm probably not on the far end of that spectrum of plotting. I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I personally find it great to surprise myself. You know, at that point, like you're saying, you get to 70,000 words, you go, oh, that's actually what happened. Right? Never knew that. That's good. The other thing that's interesting about your stuff, Greg, as opposed to the others, is you're writing historical crime fiction. In a world before mobile phones, digital communication, all of the things that that basically dominate modern crime. So, you know, it's sort of easy, isn't it?
I'm not the world's most technical guy. So I did want to avoid social media, phones, etc. But because it happened from an event that happened in the past, in my family's history, I wanted to set it back in the 60s. I love that era. One thing that made me, you know, I did think for a while about setting it now, can I take that story and will it work now? And I tried messing around in my head with it, but no, it wouldn't. The one thing about it in real life that did happen was my father just used to disappear for weeks on end when he was a commercial traveler, and he would just vanish for weeks on end. And my mother was looking after the 5 kids. There were 5 brothers. And once in a while she'd get a phone call out of the blue from Dad, and it'd generally be a pretty quick one because phone calls were very, very expensive then, you know, very expensive. So expensive he could only afford one about every 2 weeks or so. But I think I like the idea that someone could just disappear, drop off the edge and be unaccountable for and not be able to be tracked easily. Whereas if I had phones, social media, there's always a trail. You cannot disappear for very long unless you're Melissa Caddick.
I was just going to say that one of the advantages of having novels set in a rural area is that you can sort of shape it to how you want, because phone connection
That's
where I live is pretty haphazard.
It can go down at
So
any time.
You can drop it when it suits, or bring it in when it suits too. So that actually helps.
But it is, I mean, the idea of just being able to contact someone on a landline, and if they're not next to it, well, you're not going to be able to contact them. That's quite appealing as you know, as a plot device. Margaret, do you think I don't know, like this idea that yes, communications are a little bit more difficult, but I mean, in your book in particular, you know, and you can't really ignore it now, can you? When people are trackable by their phones all the time, they're pinging off something. They're, you know, how much of that? I mean, look, it's sort of difficult to do it in a way that is right. You know, it's hard, isn't it?
So for the phone pinging in Stonetown, I looked at the murder. I've forgotten the name now of the woman who it was. There was that case in Melbourne where the woman her body was found in Brissenden, and the man, that there was the phone pings that they'd found, a series of pings as he'd driven up, buried her in the body in Brissenden, and then gone back to Melbourne and wound back his car or something, did something to the car, and but the pings were the things that got him. So sorry,
I said the ping's the thing.
the ping's the thing. So I looked at those pings in that case, and I sort of mirrored them for this one.
Yeah, great. Look, at this stage, we might open up for some questions if there's anybody who's got any questions in the audience.
Michael, we've got a couple on Zoom.
Okay.
The first one is for Adrian. What prompts you to choose female detectives as your main characters in Canticle Creek, as well as the excellent Gunshot Road and Diamond Dove?
Oh, right. What prompts? I don't know anything particularly. I suppose it's just that when you're trying to think of a main character who would be interesting to the reader, all of us have a little bit of a sense of making our central figures a bit of an outsider. I think all three of us do. I mean, I think all four of us do, as I think about it. Yeah. So that's one of the things that makes just a person a bit more interesting. So I suppose in choosing a female, I was just choosing someone who would be going against the grain of I know obviously there's plenty of female police officers around, but it still seems to be a fairly patriarchal sort of organisation. So that's just one of the things to make the person more interesting, I think. And I think bring other things as well, interest in geology and I've invented a new genre, the geological thriller, which is hasn't sold very well, but it moves like glacier. But I sort of just want to keep the person as an outsider, maybe as different from me as I can get.
And the second question is, a few panelists at a previous session said we've had a huge run of mysteries set in the outback in small and remote locations. And now that it's high time for the mysteries to get back to the big city, how would you respond to that? And that's for the whole of the panel.
Better ask Michael about that. I think he's
There's plenty of good thrillers set in cities. Just, you know, I can name a few. But I am waiting for you know, clearly, as we've been discussing, the whole rural noir thing is having a real moment. And I think that's absolutely fantastic, and it is great. But you know, there's no reason why you can't a good crime novel set in the city can't say as much about community, as much about the Australian experience. I mean, Australian cities are unique, right? They are unique in their own right. So I'm waiting for the dial to swing back the other way too. I reckon that'd be good.
I reckon it will swing back. It will, won't it? Surely it's got to.
Well, I think it's a great thing is that that the fact that the sort of outback noir or the rural noir has such a big following now is actually turning a spotlight on all Australian crime fiction. And
I started to think, if it does turn back, will I be able to write Metro, because I'm at such a rural person? But then I think plenty of Metro people write rural crime. Probably the majority of them live in cities. So surely I can take a piece of that, the Metro pie too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm living in the mean streets of Mossman at the moment. And so I feel a bit of a fraud actually writing about a small New England town. But
You could write about the small delicatessen.
I was thinking of writing one about Mossman actually, but I think I'd probably be run out of town on a rail. But I look, for me, it's I love the particular town I've created there. I'm digging deeper into it. There's a third book that hopefully will be picked up by the publisher. It's there, and I've got a fourth one in mind. So I don't want to. I hope that the pendulum doesn't swing too far back towards cities, but I would like to write something contemporary and set it in a city as well at some time. Perhaps not Mossman.
Well, I think the truth is that if you talk to publishers, a decade or so ago, they couldn't sell Australian crime fiction, wherever it was set, they couldn't sell it. And now, of course, we're going through this sort of moment, which, it's great.
I was just going to say, the person I still think of as the greatest Australian crime writer, the late, great Peter Temple, he'd set both. He'd have them sort of highlighting each other.
Yes.
I'm glad you think so.
But I mean, his city stuff was extraordinary, right?
Yeah, it is too. But so is the Broken Shore, set in a small coastal village.
Yeah. Any other questions? There's one down here.
I actually wanted to kind of expand on that last question from Zoom there a little bit. And, when you're writing, Greg, years ago, rurality was something so separate from the city. The city wouldn't find out about what was going on in towns until people had physically traveled the distance. And there will come a day when historical fiction will include digital communication. What is rurality in that era?
Sorry, Felix,
what is rurality in that era when digital communication is historical?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question either, but
So are you meaning, Felix, when like the social media and all that is just as available in the rural towns? How can you make something rural when we're also
because that future keeps marching. Eventually that distance grows smaller and smaller and smaller. What makes rural identity in a future where that distance is so tiny?
Or even now, right? I mean, because it's just as connected now.
Yeah, I think that,
Margaret's so glad you're
writing
asking that question. You're answering this question.
Thank you. Both Adrian and Margaret, Felix, are writing stuff set in rural towns, and they still, and they're set now. And as Adrian mentioned before, the phone signal goes down sometimes. That seems to be one way of limiting it, of communication there. But they're both set and they're both using, I think both books, people use social media, don't they? Or certainly yours do. I like the idea of not having to use it, but nonetheless, news travels very quickly. Things don't change quickly in the bush. I think even now, change is slow to come to the bush, but news travels very quickly. There's the bush telegraph, and even in mine, even though it's set in the second one set in 1971, people used phones all the time, and and there's police radios as well. So there is that. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the morality. Oh, rurality. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's why I was baffled. Rurality. Yeah.
hard
Yeah,
work.
look, I think that it's a geographical thing, the rurality, and just as Agatha Christie was using small villages for Miss Marple and so on, and you know, I think the rurality, it becomes a character in its own right, really, the small town.
I hope not. I can barely say it. Rurality. Agricultural, it might be a bit easier for me.
Rurality.
Is it a mindset as well? I mean, you know, is there a different sort of reality to rurality?
Well, only in the sense that you're constantly living, as you know, when Marg's going for her daily walks, nature is just in your face all the time. I sort of take as my credo those lines from Walter Savage Land or something like, I strove with none, for none were worth my strife. Nature I loved, and next to nature. So art I loved, and I strove with none. Nature I loved, and next to, I forgot anyway, but it's just to sort of think about how important nature is to our lives, and we reflect it in our art. Nature I loved.
I think as a kid coming to a country town, as a very young kid coming to Tamworth, we were at the new estate at the edge of South Tamworth, and there were paddocks at the back of our house. I went back now, well, not now, a few years ago when I was writing the book and researching it, and those paddocks are now about 1 kilometre of suburb now, back to back. But in the day, the kids, my brothers, would jump the fence and disappear for the day. And in fact, we were, you know, you'd be told by your mother to get out of the house and don't come back until the sun's going down, you know, come back for dinner, time for dinner.
It was like that growing up in Canberra, you know, I mean, the paddocks everywhere, you know, and this is the interesting thing about those pressures we're talking about, the pressures on communities, development pressures on communities, that forced change, which, you know, perhaps they're not quite ready for. Anyone else? Over here.
My question's mainly to Margaret, though perhaps to others. You mentioned a little bit about the city-rural divide and how that plays out. I'm curious, looking over the last 3 or 4 years, there has been two things: the politics of essentially the rural politicians bagging and promoting that divide, but also a hell of a lot of people moving from cities to rural areas. And I'm just curious to see, you as a member of that community, how do you see those tensions playing out, and do you think they're subjects for future exploration in your works?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As I said, you know, that little story about the assistant principal and certainly in Stonetown with this real estate agent buying up land. At the moment where I'm from, there's a lot of tension because it's solar farms. So a lot of farmers are selling for solar farms. And while my first instinct is to think that's a wonderful thing because solar farms are great for, you know, all those reasons. But this is really good farming land and really good, you know, we need food. we need to feed a growing population, and so there's and they're incredibly ugly. So it's really quite it's really interesting, this internal dilemma, you know, do we welcome these things? But yeah, there is a real tension, but there's also really wonderful things as well. There's marvelous things about having all these great people moving into, and they're so innovative and creative. And now we've got a little art gallery in the town where I am, and you know, we have a great cafe, and so stuff like that. There's lots to celebrate about the blurring of the lines between the metro and the rural, but there's some things we've got to take caution with, I think.
And the pressures and tensions of that clearly some great grist for the mill. Yeah. Anyone else? Of course you can. Oh no, here's one down here.
I just wanted to ask about the authenticity of the writer. Obviously, I'm not Australian. Yeah, I'm not Australian. So do you think you have to have lived in an Australian rural town to write about such Jane Harper was born in Manchester.
Exactly. I was about to
Yeah.
say, I don't think Jane Harper was
But she
Australian.
did grow up in Victoria and then went
Right.
back and then came back. I didn't know that until after I'd read the dry. So I couldn't see it when I was reading the dry, having grown up in Manchester. So I don't quite know how she did it, but I'm determined to find out. But do you think that you have to have experience, or anybody, do you have of living in a rural town?
I think it helps, but it's not
Yeah.
essential. I think you can write about anywhere you want to, really.
Would it be offensive though, you know, to set your story in a rural Australian rural town and not be Australian and not have even lived in a rural town?
I don't see why it would. I mean, it wouldn't offend me if you wanted to write about Mossman at all. but it would probably.
Authenticity is the point, right? If you can write about it in a way that is authentic, then it doesn't matter if you haven't lived there.
I know that the cover of my second Stone Town, when it came out, you know, I was quite happy with it and all that sort of thing. And then I showed it to my husband, who's from the Mallee. He's a Mallee boy, and he looked at the front cover and said, "That's not Australian wheat. That's not Australian wheat."
Yeah, there you are.
And since then, I've had lots of people say to me, "That's not wheat. That's American wheat. That's not an Australian brand." So the stuff like that is really interesting. But no, I think I'm with Greg. All credit Jane Harper. I wouldn't want to limit anyone writing about anything. You know, it's fiction. Yeah.
I remember asking Chris Hammer, one of our great crime writers, about whether he does much research, and he said, "Not very much. I only do enough to convince you that I know a whole lot more than you about what I'm doing." And I think that kind of applies to me a bit too. I don't think it's necessary to have lived in a place, but it sure helps if you visited it, I think, to give it a sense of authenticity. But the same applies with, characters or in unusual occupations that you know nothing about. It's just a writer doing their due diligence, I think. I'm not Indigenous, and I'm daring as a white man to write Indigenous characters, but I've certainly done a lot of research about it, and I've had Indigenous cultural advisors going over it and people reading it from Anaiwan country and so on, and they tell me it's okay. And if I've made mistakes, then they're mine, not theirs. But I have tried to do my due diligence in all areas, and I think most of these guys too. They got me in, and
I mean, I think it really is about, I'm speaking from my
It's a
own
nice
personal experience.
segue.
I hate reading books set in newsrooms which don't ring true. I've spent my entire professional life in a newsroom, and I can tell you straight away that would never happen, right? So, and it's like doctors are the same. They hate reading things about hospitals that just wouldn't happen, or machines that wouldn't beep, and that sort of stuff. So you just have to get that detail right so that those people don't go, "Oh, that's put the book down."
But
Michael, that's a great segue into another question that's on Zoom. How do people in your small communities respond to the characters in your books? Do they accuse you of writing them? And I guess that was the sort of question I was going to ask about how you choose the names of the people you use, because, for the villains particularly.
I find the good ones don't mind and the bad ones don't tend to read books anyway.
The mechanic in my town, his name's Mick, and he's great. And he said to me, my windscreen was cracked. I hit a roo, and he was fixing up the car, and he said, "Just one question: is the murder, or is one of the bad guys in your books based on me?" And in my head, I thought, why would you ask such a question? And I said, no, it's not. But I went away thinking, maybe it is a little.
Maybe there's something to
Maybe
that.
it is a little. And then other people in my apparently I have too many Ians and Barrys, and a lot of people who are called. Yeah, no, I do get a lot of people in my town thinking that it's them. Yes, so names are really hard.
Yeah. All right, look, we've run out of time. Thank you all very much, and please thank the panel. What a fantastic discussion. And thank you all for coming. Keep
Thank-
enjoying what's left of the Bad Crime Festival, and hope to see you all again next year. Thanks a lot.